Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the Bookstore. Whether you're joining us on Crowdcast or Facebook Live or even YouTube Live, thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to our live stream series where we host authors and speakers, and we keep the conversation going about books we love. Our featured book this evening is The Stone Girl by DIRK WITTENBORN. If you haven't yet purchased the book, I'd like to encourage you to do so. Purchasing DIRK's book through us helps support the author, our staff, and it helps support us as an indie bookstore during this really strange and weird time that we're living in. If you click the green button below, it's right below my face here, it will direct you to our website to purchase a first edition copy of DIRK's book. And if you order exclusively through us, you'll also receive a signed book plate. DIRK was nice enough to send us some signed book plates that will include in each and every book that you order. We do have a limited supply, so hit the green button below, place your order, and you'll get your book with signed book plate from DIRK. If you're watching this through Facebook Live or YouTube Live, look in the comments section, and you should see we've provided a link there as well, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. Now on to our program this evening. We are honored to welcome DIRK WITTENBORN and Griffin Dunne to virtual Harrisburg. Griffin Dunne is an accomplished actor, director, and producer. His feature film directorial debut was 1997's Addicted to Love, starring Meg Ryan and Matthew Broderick, which he followed 1 year later with Practical Magic, starring Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman. He also directed Fierce People with Chris Evans and Kristen Stewart, based on the novel by, you guessed it, DIRK WITTENBORN. In 2017, Dunne directed and produced the Netflix documentary Joan Didion, The Center Will Not Hold, to rave reviews. Currently, Dunne can be seen on the mega hit NBC series This Is Us. And while we're here, just an extra huge thank you to Griffin for taking the time out of his busy schedule and joining us here this evening. Now, of course, our author this evening is DIRK WITTENBORN. He is a novelist, screenwriter, the Emmy-nominated producer of the HBO documentary Born Rich, and co-writer and co-producer of the feature film The Lucky Ones. His last novel before The Stone Girl was Pharmacon. He lives in New York City. Now, our featured novel again this evening is titled The Stone Girl. Here it is again, which is a riveting tale of deception, vengeance, and power set against the haunting beauty of the Adirondack wilderness. And before I hand it off to Griffin and DIRK, I'd like to encourage you to ask questions. We love questions. Please click the Ask a Question button. Again, it's below my face, below the green button. If you have a question for either DIRK or Griffin, I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll save some time after the interview to go over your questions. But at this time, please join me in welcoming onto the screen Griffin Dunne and DIRK WITTENBORN.
Hey, DIRK.
Hey, Griff.
There we are. We're just the two of us. We're finally alone.
Yeah, finally.
Where are you?
I'm in the Springs, right near East Hampton, at the mouth of 3 Mile Harbor, in a very, very small spider-infested cottage with a beautiful view.
Well, I am in Rhinebeck, New York. Fortunate enough to be up here, and fortunate enough to be talking to you about your book with my old friend DIRK, a book I just loved, as I've loved all your books. Before we get into Stone Girl, I thought people might be interested to know, kind of how we met. Well, we were friends, but really what's clinched our friendship was you handing me basically a shoebox of pages.
Exactly.
A novel called Fierce People.
Unfinished, actually.
And it was unfinished, exactly. And I read it in record time. And I got to what I hoped would be the ending and didn't have an ending. And I said to you, you come up with an ending. I want to make this movie. I want to make this into a movie. And you came up with a great ending. And we made a wonderful movie together.
Wonderful. And you kept saying as you were reading it, please don't tell me he's the bad guy.
Yes. And we got a great cast, and it turned out really well. And
Donald Sutherland. We had the legend.
And we discovered Anton Yelchin and Kristen Stewart and Chris Evans. And so before I get into the book, I'd love you to read a passage of your choosing.
This is how the book opens. At the end of the summer of 2018, high atop a nearly inaccessible gorge deep in the Adirondack forest of New York State's North Country, 3 women had an unusual monument set in place. Elegantly tapered, nearly 10 feet tall, a hand-chiseled obelisk of native bluestone, inscribed with brass capitals, caught the light of the sun. Weighing in excess of 2,000 pounds, it had the solemn presence of a memorial to war dead. A marker worthy of a state courthouse or a city square made no sense in the middle of nowhere. And yet it did. To the others, Evie Quimby referred to it as a calling lure, an old-fashioned expression commonly used by trappers. A calling lure draws a beast out of its lair and tempts it into a snare. Usually such lures are scents, barkstone, civet, skunk, blood, and the like. Their messages carried on the wind, beckoning so potent and pungent and closely related in the animal's mind to sex and or prey that they trigger urges the creature cannot resist. That obelisk's inscription had no smell, but the words spelled out in brass were guaranteed to get inside the head of one man. Its message was simple. We know what you are. But the truth was, when those three women first put up that stone, none of them knew the true nature of what they were after or up against.
So this book, like other books, like your other books, they deal with class in America, and the have and have-nots, and it also deals with many other important issues that I'll get into later. But tell us about your interest in class and speak biographically.
Well, my interest in class is I was the child of academics who were kind of hired thinkers, and they were taken up by wealthy people. And so I was kind of the poor boy at the party. And it was a strange perspective to suddenly find myself dropped in a community that had no sidewalks, and where people rode horses the way we rode bikes when I was little. And so I've had this exposure to a world that I wasn't really part of. And I became acutely aware, as I know, Griffin, you go to New York and you're struggling, you're making $250 a week and living in one room. And I was amazed by these kids would have these great lofts. And I kept going, God, I'm such a loser. And I was so naive, I didn't realize, of course, they had trust funds. But it seemed more and more, when we first came to New York, money really wasn't cool in the 70s when I came. I'm a bit older than you. But I watched money become more and more important, and in the 80s, and I watched the nature of the city change. So it intrigued me to write this book, to set it in the Adirondacks, because the county is called Townsend County, which is mythical. But there is a county called Hamilton County in the Adirondack Forest, which is 8.5 hour drive from New York City. It's in the middle of a 6 million acre forest. And it is the poorest county in the state of New York. The average income, like in 2007, I know, was about $11,000 a year. And people get by really on roadkill, poaching, food stamps, and they endure this incredibly harsh winter in trailers and things like that. Also in this county are people that have 100,000 acres. And the Adirondacks are famous for that. These legendary families, the Whitneys, the Guggenheims, the Rockefellers, have these incredible spreads. And so what interested me as a locale was you had the juxtaposition of great wealth and real hardscrabble rural poverty. What also interested me was that guns, that people have guns there, and that is their way of life, and shooting and trapping. And it was, I was exposed to that stuff when I was a kid growing up. I grew up in a very rural place, and I wanted to write about it now. I've been thinking about it a long time. The forest.
You have a pretty insidious group of men that we follow from their prep school beginnings, called the Lost Boys, and as they take their place and the upper echelons of white power. Did you have a particular group in mind? And did you base that on anything?
Well, first, as you know, I've run into, for sure, as many male gold diggers or fortune hunters as women. And in fact, the ones I've encountered are far more successful, the men, at it. And that's just something that I've observed in New York City. I have no statistics for it. But about 15 years ago, I heard a story from a French woman about there were a group of men, very much like these lost boys that they call themselves in the novel, that were cherry-picked from the best universities in France. And they weren't really the best student, but they were always very charming, very good looking. And he gave them, you know, a great apartment, this lawyer, funded their apartment, gave them a Ferrari, and introduced them to troubled, vastly rich women. And of course, because this was in the 70s, in the period of drugs, and when they were so prevalent, no one believed them when they said, my husband is exploiting me, or my husband's a beast. And one of them was killed. She complained about this. She vanished, and they found her in a morgue in Italy. And I found the story hard to believe, and then I began to check it out. And one of them, they'd all be best men and ushers at each other's weddings. And one of them then went on to marry another woman, and she complained of the same thing. But these guys never went to jail. And I just thought, how insidious, because when someone tells you, I love you, you're wonderful, I dream of you, these are things we all want to hear and we want to believe. And, you know, it's it just, there was something so grotesque about it. And then where there were some other factors that made me want to explore sexual violence towards women. But that was really where the germ of the story itself came from.
Well, which leads me to the next thing. One of the themes I appreciated in the book was the issue of sexual violence towards women, just brutal violence, and how that violence transcends to the next generation, and the and the effect that has, and the very satisfying. I think I'm going to give away something, but there's the women reach their there's a nice venue.
They refuse to turn themselves into commodities or victims.
Yes. And anyway, it's very, very satisfying. The machinations and the plots you've done. And, but it struck me, you know, as something very personal with you, the violence against women. And I wondered if that was, you know, one of the motors that drove your through line in telling the story.
Well, the story I just told you about the people in France, that was just an incident, a structure, a way to set up a story that dealt with that subject. What really, my fascination and the deep disturbance I feel about this phenomenon in our culture really stems from, first, my wife, Kirsten, and secondly, from our daughter. And when I met Kirsten in 1992, and during the first year of our relationship, I was thinking of writing a book about sexual abuse, a novel. And when I mentioned this to her, she said to me, what do you know about sexual abuse? And I explained what sort of inspired the book at that point. And she said, well, I was a victim of violent sexual abuse as a teenager. And she proceeded to speak about her experience and the phenomenon in general with such, you know, heartbreaking candor and strength and bravery that I realized two things. First, this is a remarkable woman. And secondly, I need to know a hell of a lot more about sexual abuse if I'm going to tackle this subject. So about 25 years later, well, I'm 25 years later, but when my daughter, we were married and we had a child, and when our daughter was 12, we told her about what had happened to my wife and the abuse she suffered. And I saw then, as a father, as a parent, how the legacy of it, that what had happened to my wife, then how it affected my daughter and her view of the world and her view of men, and that was profoundly disturbing to me. And then I began to think about how to do it, and saw that I could use that previous story I told you about in France, work it into it. But then, it became kind of an urgent thing when Trump made his infamous misogynist statement about grabbing women, and still got elected. And then I was just like stupefied. I have to write this. And that was about 4 years ago.
Do you think that since Me Too and now Black Lives and the isolation that so many of us have been in during COVID, do you see a sea change in relations between men and women? And do you feel that there will be a change?
I mean, America's, in regards to misogyny and race, we're long overdue for a come to Jesus moment, and both issues are cast a shadow over our culture and our lives. I think the sad reality is, I'm told and I've read that abuse of women is up during the confinement, that domestic abuse, that women are trapped, that there's ever more that feeling of, oh, I have to put up with this for the family. And I think in 2018, there was a survey that 1 in 5 women have either been at some point in their life raped, or someone has attempted to rape them. That's an astounding statistic to me. And in 50% of the cases, it's, I think, roughly 50, it's someone they have been intimate with in the past. And in 40-some% of the cases, it's an acquaintance, a friend. And I mean, and that defines betrayal. Again, that's what I said earlier, that thing of, we want to hear, you're great, you can trust me, I care about you. And it turns dark. And through my conversations with my wife, who's a psychologist, over the years, I became aware of the fact that as a man, when I go out in the world or by myself or out into a crowd or a place, it never occurs to me someone is going to say something I don't want to hear, or make or touch me in a way I don't want. But that's omnipresent for women. They're always feeling that. And that fear, it's not exactly fear, but it's in the back of their head. And they have reason to be cautious, wary, frightened. And it was thinking about that made me really put this story in the context of a thriller, to use suspense. Because I imagine myself as a woman going, it could happen now. It could happen any minute. And certainly, it's when you're trying to find a movie, you go to the, any of these, the servers, and you go, is there any movie where the girl doesn't get, raped, slapped around, decapitated, slashed? I mean, we feed into that fantasy. And I sometimes wonder, do men create that fantasy? I mean, there's something self-perpetuating about it. And it's one thing how women deal with it. And this is a story about how women deal with it. But I also wanted to explore where it comes from in men, that the element of power, what it stems from. Because you and I know that we, through life, you hear men say just horrible things about women often, and just arrogant guys who look like they're a troll under a bridge talking about a woman being unattractive or overweight. Like, what are you, an Adonis? And there is this terrible double standard. And I think that I really think that I feel I failed in some ways when I would hear those sort of things over the last 50 years. I would just go, what an asshole, what a jerk, pathetic, and walk away. I wouldn't say anything. But I think I really won as a male who cares about this, really should be as intolerant of that kind of conversation and speak out just the way you would about a racist comment, you know, because it is kind of the same kind of really ugly bigotry.
Well, you did, but I just want to remind the audience too, this is indeed a thriller, and with all of these issues and with, you know, extraordinary plot turns, and it's so completely unpredictable what happens. So, you know, addressing your process when you're writing a novel, do you follow the story? I mean, are you surprised by the plot developments as the audience is while you're writing it, or do you sort of map it out and then follow the map or stray from it?
I have an idea of. I begin thinking I have an idea of where I'm going. I began this book a little differently than some of my other novels because I was thinking, can I write these women characters? They're women. They're four generations of women, and can I do it? Can I pull this off? Can I be as knowledgeable about the forest as I was about downtown New York or something, and or at least seem as knowledgeable. And so I began just writing. And the fun part of writing for me is one of the few fun parts sometimes is when you had the story planned one way in your head when you sat down that day, and you go, no, I could do it this other way, and you surprise yourself. So I wrote a version of this book. My first draft, and I noodled with it a bit, was about 100 pages longer. And I realized I got into my stride at about page 120. So I rewrote the first 150 pages. And so that was my process in this, that I found my way into the story and into the possible nuances and subtleties of the very complicated relationships these women have with each other and with the outside world.
And when you rewrote the 120 pages, was that based on where you thought the story would go, or you gave yourself?
It was a different setup. It was using information that sometimes, or scenes or events that happened later in the book, and stacking them, constructing it in a different way, a different build, and keeping it terser, and really trying to keep the suspense, ever escalating it with each chapter.
Well, you did. I also want to talk about another book of yours I just love, called Pharmacon, and which is also, but even more so than your other books, particularly personal.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could tell us what that book was about.
Well, the first line of the book was, "I was born because a man came to kill my father," and that was a true story. My father was a neuropsychopharmacologist. He was one of the pioneers of drug research after the Second World War. And they had no intention of having another child. But I discovered when I was 12, I observed very strange behavior in my household. Like when I was 8, if I had a little league game, I'd come home and my father would go, "No game. We're going to Florida. We're going to go fishing." And I go, "I'll miss my game. I have school." And my father would go, "No, we're going." And my father had a patient that came to kill him. And he was at Yale then. And my parents were out in the front of their house, and they were planting tulips. And my mother was just about ready this guy was in the middle of the street walking. He seemed lost. My mother was going to about ready to stand up and say, "Can I help you?" When my father said, "Don't look up and don't say a word. He has a death list and we're number one." My mother thought he was kidding at first, and then of course was furious when she found out he was telling the truth. He tried to call a psychiatrist who was number two on the death list, and the death list included the president of Yale and all sorts of people. He tried to call him, and this is before they had answering machines, and didn't reach him. And later in the afternoon, gunshots rang out, and the man had been shot by this patient, and his wife had been terribly beaten. Terribly beaten.
Father, see the murder?
Pardon?
No.
No. And so my sisters remember having to hide. Well, hide in the house and police coming, my older sisters. But I was never told this till I was 12, 13. And it was a very disturbing thing. I was saying to my father, I'd done terribly in math. I said, "If I'm such a disappointment, why do you even have me?" And my father said, "Because a man I tried to help came to kill me." And I said, "By God, you're not going to deny my life. I'm going to have another child." Not that you would think a psychologist would be more gentle with a 12-year-old, but that's where the book came out of that. And my fascination, and that kind of haunted my family. You know, I think that's why my father, certainly we were all taught about guns at a very early age. And once I knew that, it all began to make sense. And occasionally this patient who was brilliant, he was a student at Yale, who then went on to Harvard Divinity School. He would escape from the state mental hospital in Connecticut every few years. And obviously my mother was frightened to death. And he was a real ghost.
What became of him? And is he no longer with us? And he was released finally. He was released almost as soon as my father died. And I think my father had been assured that he would stay contained until my mother died as well. But he was, right after my dad died in the 80s. It occurs to me that your father was a psychiatrist and you married one.
My father was a psychologist and I married a psychologist. My sister liked to say, "You married Dad."
Yeah.
But far more,
Dad.
far kinder. My father was like the thinking man's great Santini. He was a tough character in his own way, but charming, good, very good storyteller, and had a kindness and a deep sympathy for rural poor. Had an amazing life.
So both Pharmacon and Stone Girl are also they're just so visual, and as I said earlier, the plots are constantly surprising and very cinematic. Has there been interest from film or television?
They've been talking a bit about it. I keep waiting for you to call me up about it, Griff.
Okay. Well,
it's a 10-part limited series. As we know, and most people know, because of COVID, Hollywood's kind of frozen and at the moment. But I kept, I've always, I'm crazy about film, as you know, and as I think about something I'm going to write, I see it in my head always as a film, writing a scene, and in this, I kind of channeled. I remember when I was a kid, they had this thing called $1 Million Movie. You remember?
Yeah, I remember very well.
And they would show the same movie twice a day, 5 days in a row. So you could, and they were classics that no one was really paying attention to then. So you could almost memorize them. And there was a quality in them, a slowness of things like The Magnificent Amberson. There was a very novelistic, or that really ingrained itself in my fantasy life.
Yeah, well, that's how I know practically every line of dialogue from Damn Yankees.
Right. Yeah.
Watching it twice a day for 5 days a week.
And the second show wasn't at night, late. You had to sneak out.
Right.
Yeah. But so that's really the visual thing. And the thing about it, the Adirondacks, I urge people to go there because this is like somewhere, there are all these mountains that are over 4,000 feet tall, plummeting gorges, waterfalls, just incredibly verdant. And the tragedy is, it's again, as I said earlier, it's so poor. And in researching this, my wife and I drove up, and as we drove up, all these police cars passed us and pulled over. And sure enough, there was some little trailer, they were cooking meth up, and people arrested. It's very depressed. It's just
who are the great old families that are still there that own?
The Whitneys have a huge place. The Posts, I believe, have a famous place, and the camps there are these kind of giant gingerbread fairy tale structures, 3 stories with 60-foot long porches built up on the lakes with Swiss chalet guest cottages. And the railings are often made of they take tree limbs and they work them into shapes, and all these stuffed animals. It's another time, and really it flourished and in America when before the turn of the last century, when people would take their trains up, and it was the way to escape the city heat. And it was before places really like East Hampton or Newport. Well, Newport became fashionable early, but people didn't so much go to the beach in the summer to escape the squalor and filth of the city. They went to the Adirondacks.
Well, as I said, I'm here in Rhinebeck, and a few miles from here are the Astors and the Livingstons, and this was also a vacation place at the turn of the century. And John Jacob Astor, who eventually died in the Titanic, they would build these palaces to themselves. And there's one entire house that looks like a wedding cake, and it's their gambling casino.
Right.
And it has an indoor swimming pool and indoor tennis. And what always interests me about the Adirondacks, though, is, the Adirondacks, for me to drive to the Adirondacks from here, it would take me 6 hours. It was still, for those families taking even private train, it had to take 12, 15, 18 hours.
When you went for a period of time in the summer, a month, 2 months, and you brought guests in on the train. But we used to go to a place in Maine similar to that, which was a club, and it was kind of interesting. And my parents were Midwesterners, and some people from New Haven took us there. And it was where 2 rivers ran into fed out of the lake. And it was fascinating for me to look at the old guest book and to see, Prussian princes fishing there in 1880, and a record of every fish that was caught was, you jotted it down in the book, and all these stuffed animals. And for a boy growing up, it was just magical. And there were guides, many of whom were part Indian, and it all intrigued me. And it stayed very, very vivid in my imagination. But it was also a place people went to misbehave. And in this one place that I went, the men would go up in the summer before the wives, and they'd often bring some girls from the Follies with them, and they'd make home movies. And it always struck me as, why do people go to these places? Why do you want such privacy, and what are you up to? And it affords that. The privacy has very good outcome in a way for some of the characters in some ways, but is tragic and allows for real darkness to creep into their lives on another level.
Well, that is your you got your finger on the pulse of bad behavior turning terribly bad.
These are bad.
And there is a comeuppance that comes to men with power who abuse the poor and abuse women, and it's really exciting to see them suffer. at the end. I'm going to open this up now to questions that have been coming in. Let's just see what we got here. Okay. Dirk, how do you prepare yourself to write from a woman's point of view in an authentic way? Is it difficult for you?
Well, it's a challenge, but again, because I had a distant father, I was really raised by my mother was a scientist, and she knew everything, every French irregular verb. And I never had to pay attention in school because she would reteach me everything. And then I was brought up because I was the youngest child, and she was kind of bored of being a parent. My sisters brought me up, and they were enough older than I so that when they were in their teens, dating and going out with boys, they'd often bring me along on their dates. And then one of my sister's first marriage, which wasn't ideal, said I was often her confidant. So I heard these kind of, I heard their frustrations. I think they liked my company, but I also had an insight that was very strange for a 9, 10, 12-year-old boy to have in the romantic and emotional disappointments of women with men via my sisters. So when and then being married to a psychologist. So oftentimes, as I was writing this book, I would go to my wife and say, "Does this ring true? How is this the right response? Does this register?" And actually, the heroine, hero of the book, Evie, is very much in character like my wife.
All right. Sorry, this is for me, Dirk. Griffin, what other types of books and authors do I enjoy? How does this relate to your being the nephew of such an esteemed author? Well, I like all sorts of books. I'm quite an avid reader, and I became aware of my aunt, who's Joan Didion, of her writing, and my uncle, John Gregory Dunne, her husband. At quite an early age, we were given their books as Christmas presents inscribed, and it really set me on the path to being an avid reader and a lover of particularly of journalism. Next question. Dirk and Griffin, I'd love to hear both of you speak on class and how it relates to race for you. Thank you. Go for it.
Well, to me, class can color in certain instances the race question. But for me, the racial problems in America stem from white America has never accepted its guilt and responsibility for the legacy of slavery. I heard a guy on WNPR the other day, I forget he was I think a professor, a law professor at Georgetown, and he said, as a black man, when a policeman sees me, they don't see a law professor. They see a black guy. And it was I was driving, and it just struck me as, that is the problem. And class, money on one level changes everything. If you're rich enough, you will be popular no matter where you go, except if your car breaks down, your Rolls Royce breaks down on the highway and you're an African man. Police very well might perceive you as a threat, as a thief, who knows? But so they're different issues. They're different. I think class the class problem in America is a broader thing that we've become more and more class oriented. To me, I watched that in the 80s. Money became more important. The consumerism, judging people by their worth. Very, very few people who've made a great deal of money will admit they got very lucky. They think are blessed with insights and intelligence they don't often have.
I'd say I became aware of class and race at the age of 6. Growing up in Los Angeles, I grew up in a family. My father was in the entertainment industry. We grew up among very cultured people who were making movies and television, and highly sophisticated people. And then the Watts riots happened, and I remember this so vividly of seeing the fires from Watts would come over and float over Beverly Hills, where we lived. And there was a restaurant called the Hamburger Hamlet that the owners of the restaurant, and a noblesse oblige, took it upon, felt they only had African Americans working in the kitchen and as waitresses and waiters. And that was at that time thought of, oh, isn't that wonderful that they're hiring. And then these terribly sophisticated people would say, I would overhear, don't go to the Hamburger Hamlet during the riots because they're going to poison your food. And then I became aware there's no one is safe from this kind of thinking. People that were so terribly cultured still say things like that.
Yeah.
From Karen, what are some qualities in literature that draw you personally to adapt to a film? What inspires you to make that adaptation?
For you?
No, you. Well, it's supposed to be you take it.
What inspires me to adapt something into a film?
Yes.
Well, though I've only had one novel be adapted into a film by you, and what it inspired me was you liked the story so much, and in the main character Finn in Fierce People, I could tell there was so much you identified with. It's about a 14-year-old boy and his mother, who's troubled in many ways, but again sees maybe too much of the world. She's a masseuse and she enters a very wealthy community, and you cared so much about it, and that's one reason it unfolded the way it did, and it was fun. If you remember, God, we did so many drafts of that script, and in the course of it, Griffin is such a great raconteur. He would tell, we kind of exchanged stories about our childhood. And each of us, I think, had, this isn't answering the question, but each of us had these quirky, happy, sad childhoods that, so it was really fun to do it. I think if I was to adapt something that someone else had written, what it would be a story that could be told in a different way in a film than the book. You can't, a book is a book, a novel is a novel. That's one way to tell a story. But if you want to turn a novel into a film, and you can probably speak to this more eloquently than I, Griffin, you have to do it a different way, and it has to offer this possibility.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's also the book of where you are in your life at the time. The very first thing I adapted as a producer, it was John Macklin Silver adapted, and Amy Robinson and I produced, was an Ann Beattie novel called Chilly Scenes of Winter. At the time in our lives, we were sort of like the characters in an Ann Beattie novel, which right. Ann Beattie actually recognized when she met us and gave us the rights for a ridiculously small amount of money. But later on, as we become more sort of politically curious, we come across an article in the paper about a kids, about a child whose parents were SDS, or Weather Underground rather, and they left their kid with somebody else so they can go on living in the underground. And we became captivated and developed that with Naomi Foner writing the script for Running on Empty. I think it.
And Fierce People, you had a daughter just the age of that boy.
Exactly. I related to it completely as from the point of view of my daughter, who was the same age as the actors who played her later on, much to my daughter's chagrin, not getting the part. So all of these things take into play, but they are, as you said, very different mediums, and people are often mistaken, thinking, oh, well, just take the dialogue in the plot and hammer it in, and you got a movie. And we know that ain't the case. For Thomas, I guess that might be me too. It's my first name. What are some recent films that you would recommend for everyone? You, Dirk, go ahead. From Thomas.
Oh, that I would recommend. Well, for everyone, that's a hard thing because, you know what movie I loved was what was that movie about the Easter? More TV is coming to mind than films right now. I haven't been to the movie theater for a little while, but there are movies that have moved me immensely, like The Lives of Others. It's just astounding.
And his most recent one, the same director.
Yeah. What's that one?
Look, you're dealing with two people with terrible memory loss.
Yeah.
But it's not the painter.
I love Almodovar movies.
Yeah.
And they always cheer me up, even though they're sometimes a little bleak. I love Black Panther.
I love Paris.
I love the Spike Lee movie about the I'm blocking on the thing, but about the African American that infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan. Pardon?
That Spike's movie.
Yeah. Which one?
Klansman.
Klansman. I love Klansman. Everybody should see Klansman.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a brilliant movie.
Well, his new one is very powerful as well too.
About the Viet vets, yeah.
Yeah, and even though it's set about the Vietnam War in the 60s, it could not be more prescient to what's happening now. Okay, hold on, one last question here. What is your favorite way, yours here, to build suspense as a writer? And Griffin, since you've read the book, what did you notice most dramatically about the way the author built the suspense? Take it away.
Well, I think suspense is...
Sorry, you're right. It's called The Black Klansman. Sorry. It's not called The Klansman. The Black Klansman. They just came up here. Sorry.
Yeah. Humor what's suspenseful is when the reader knows there's menace. Then if you interject humor or something that has nothing to do with that menace, they can relax and go, oh, it's not going to happen what I think is going to happen. Or you can mislead them to think something else is going to happen, and then you can ambush them and take them to the next step, where you think if you're there's all different kinds of suspense, but the one kind that I think is interesting is if someone thinks, oh, I'm going to discover a robbery. I'm just saying this is someone stole something, and if you go, what did they steal? What did they steal? What did they steal? And they go, they stole a kidney. That's what it is. Which is, so it's scary and frightening on two levels. It takes it to a new place. And I think suspense, there's that one fear can kind of reflect another deeper fear or deeper anxiety. If that makes any sense. But yeah,
it does indeed. I'm just looking at comments. That was our last question. Answering the same question about your book. There were so many times a lesser writer could have come up to like all the plot that develops that's unpredictable by page 150 and just end it there. You just kept extending it and kept surprising us. I've just lost you, Dirk.
I'm here.
All right, I don't see you. I don't see you. You great.
I see you though.
Okay. That brings us to an end.
All right. Dirk, Griffin, thank you guys so much for joining us. We've got to wrap up here. The book is The Stone Girl. Congrats, Dirk, on the accomplishment of publishing this novel.
It's really is Never Look Away. There we go.
Never look away.
There we go.
Right.
Thank you so much, Griffin, for joining us here for this live stream, and thank you to our viewers out there for joining us, whether you're on YouTube or Crowdcast or Facebook Live. We appreciate you joining in, and thanks for sticking with us. I'm going to give it the last word to Griffin and Dirk here. Griffin, if you want to take the last word, and then we'll give it over to Dirk to close us up.
Well, I hope we do this again in your next book in person.
Yes.
And I hope you are safe. All of you listening are safe. We're in incredible times, both horrific and I think very, very hopeful. And a lot of that hope happens to be reflected in your book, which I am thrilled to talk to you about. Thank you, Dirk.
Well, thank you, Griffin. And I'd just like to say, it is within our power to change and to be, we don't live in a very contemplative age. And I know that being in self-isolation has forced me to think about things in a different way, and has been enlightening in the sense of I'm someone who has always self-medicated with people. And I think it's time, all of us, just take a good hard look at ourselves and go, I could make that a little better. I'm a little bit part of the problem. And I'm trying to do that. And most of all, I hope everyone stays healthy and well.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Stay safe, everyone. See ya.